I am Canadian. I've lived through the 2010 Olympics, the 2011 riots in Vancouver. I literally talk to beavers in my sleep. I've hiked mountains. I drink maple syrup from the fresh maple trees. That's not a maple tree. I'm as Canadian as one can be, right? I've lived here, I've grown up here, education system, everything. There's just one problem. I'm Chinese. That's not a fresh one. All jokes aside, you might be asking yourself, how the hell did some Asian dude end up in North America, and why the hell is his English so good? There's a nice thing in Canada, and we call it multiculturalism. But you may ask yourself, what is multiculturalism? To show you, we're going to go to where I learned what multiculturalism is. Hello, this is Montgomery Middle School. I went to middle school here, obviously, and this is the first place I learned what multiculturalism was. So in the mind of little Logan, this is the birthplace of multiculturalism, or at least that word. Halfway through the school year, we had this thing called the multicultural lunch, which we all brought like dishes from our backgrounds and our countries. So for me, for example, I brought pot stickers, which is not necessarily Chinese, but it's Asian enough. Right, and we just all ate together. It was a communal space. We talked about our backgrounds, where we came from, that kind of thing, and what our dishes meant to us. So yeah. Oh, what, they put a fence here too? Wait. Yeah. What is this bullshit? No, they put a fence here. I was gonna do this shot where there's like an opening there. You see that opening right there? You can go in there, but they put a fence here. Why are we bringing this up? Well, in 1982, then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, who's actually the father of famous Justin Trudeau, who is Katy Perry's boyfriend, actually flipped off a bunch of protesters in Salmon Arm, which is probably the most famous thing he did. The second most famous thing he did was set out this thing called the multicultural policy, which basically preserved all the cultures within Canada, not as one culture, like as a Canadian, but as separate things which helped create like this Canadian kind of identity. Let's compare this to our southern neighbors though, the pants of Canada, the United States of America. The United States is probably more diverse than Canada. That's like their whole thing, right? But the thing is with the US is that they're more like a melting pot where everyone gets bunched up into one thing and, you know, it just turns into the American dream, right? They're all just Americans, patriotic, freedom, ka! For Canada, though, it's more like a mosaic where every single culture is like a beautiful piece of like the painting. So if you look at the Canadian flag, for example, right, you can be like, oh yeah, the Canadian flag means this, and the red means this, the white means this. It's like everything means something, right? Instead of just everything being in one thing of like freedom, right? Freedom in heavy quotation marks. So yeah, basically the US is more about assimilation, trying to get everyone to buy into this American system. While Canada, on the other hand, we believe more in diversity, multiculturalism, let everyone kind of be who they are, right? Instead of trying to be Canadian. Canada wasn't always the nice, happy, open, diverse country it is now. In fact, in the early 1900s, Chinese immigrants had to pay an additional tax called the Chinese head tax. Very original, I know. My family actually paid this tax. Oh, at least my great-grandfather did, when he came to Canada in the early 1900s. The Chinese head tax basically was a $10 tax for every Chinese person who came into the country. There are also certain regulations and things that different ships with passengers of Chinese descent had to pass, but let's not get into that. The main thing right now is $10, which is equal to about $250 now. Can you imagine you and your happy little family of 6 people, Chinese families are much bigger than that usually, but your happy family of 6 people come into a country to live, to work, to have a better life, and you have to pay $250 per person on top of all the travel expenses. That's like going to, say, Japan and having to pay $1,000. That's crazy. But this law was passed in 1885, around when the country was starting to be formed by then Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald. Basically, what happened was they had that all the way until around 1923 when the law was abolished. And then they straight up banned Chinese people from entering the country until about 1947. pushing for multiculturalism and the influx of immigration within the country, more students from different groups are coming into our education system. My question is, are schools ready for this? In short, to answer my question, I do think Canadian schools are much more prepared for the influx of immigration than they were in the past. But that's not necessarily because of how the Canadian government are doing things or how, the education system is built. I think it's because of the adaptability of the teachers. Welcome to Charles Best. Charles Best wasn't necessarily the best at creating these multicultural events like Monty was with the multicultural lunch. But we did have a lot of students coming from different backgrounds. Do you know why? Because Canada has this thing called the immigration quota. And what they're trying to do is bring in as many immigrants as possible. The only issue with that is that with more immigrants comes families. And with more families comes kids. And with more kids, it means that kids are going to come through our system here. And Canada may not be built for that already. In the past, the Canadian school was kind of based off this thing called the banking model. The banking model was this concept created by this Brazilian educator named Paulo Freire, or PF as we're going to call him. PF described the banking model as a way for teachers to teach students. However, it was seen as a negative. Basically, all it was a teacher would tell students things and try to shove it down their tiny little brains. For example, picture it this way. And that, students, is how my wife left me. Does anyone have any questions? You can raise your hand if you have any questions. I thought this was a history class. Now class, your assignment for the end of the block is to write a 10 million word essay on how my wife broke up with me and also how everyone else broke up with me. Okay, bad example, but you get what I mean. In a banking model system, teachers don't necessarily push for critical thinking. Instead, they're info dumping on students and having them memorize what they learned. But now that there are more groups, the banking model doesn't necessarily work in the same way. Instead of everyone coming from the same area, people come from different backgrounds and have different strengths, such as familial bonds, social bonds, and economic bonds. The banking model is like a machine. It sifts information to everyone. It pushes for memorization of topics and facts, which may benefit those who grew up in a Western norm, right? But those who did not grow up in Western norm and weren't able to learn those kind of skills with their families are pushed to the side. Boom! Schools are going to teach everyone from different cultures. They can't teach everyone the same thing. That is why schools are moving on from the banking model and towards more critical learning. At Charles Best, or even in the Coquitlam School District, they want us to think about critical thinking. At middle school, they had us all together in the gym and they showed us an image. And that image had 4 images within it. And they wanted us to distinguish which one didn't belong. The Coquitlam School District is actively pushing away from the banking model and instead getting us to think more about critical learning or critical thinking. The topic of benefits. Let's imagine a school system based on no disadvantages. Everybody is equal. Everyone gets the same resources, no matter the situation. Sounds fair, right? Instead, let's picture it this way. Imagine that you and your friend are going for a walk, and you both fall. You get a small bruise, but your friend, his leg snaps completely. You both go to the hospital, and you guys both get Band-Aids. That's it. That's equality. When 2 people who have different needs get the same resources, that's equality. But is that really fair? Let's think about it this way. There's this word called equity, but what does it mean? Let's go to Logan in the future and ask him. Thank you, Dictionary Logan. Now that we know what the dictionary definition of equity is, let's go back to our old example. I picture it going something like this. Oh my gosh, you're okay? Phew, that was close. Are you okay? Oh crap, do you need a hospital? What do you think? No? What do you mean no? I'm kidding. God, you can't take a joke? It looks like you broke your leg, but we'll get that fixed right up for you. What can you do about my bruise? Oh, we can give you a band-aid or something. Should be okay otherwise. Your friend, on the other hand, is going to need a full heart surgery, but he should make a speedy recovery. As you can see, instead of both people getting the same type of resources or same amount of resources, it's adjusted slightly so that both can benefit from the amount of resources they're given. Schools do something similar to this. For example, for those who aren't fluent in English, they can take additional classes called ELL, which is English Language Learning. ELL classes are basically a place for those who aren't fluent in English, they can learn English on top of their standard English classes. Now, for teachers often try to give more resources, whether that be through online or extra books or extra lessons for those students who need more help. As a Chinese Canadian, I always found it difficult to celebrate both my Chinese heritage and Canadian heritage. But as I went up through the grades, I noticed more and more talks about my multicultural heritage, whether that be through Lunar New Year celebrations, which is classes talking about history abroad. Even things like Orange Shirt Day and Truth and Reconciliation Day are things that talk about the diverse past of our country. Schools now are more prepared than they were previously for the influx of students. Schools, at least in the Tri-City District, are actively trying to help those students who are coming from abroad, whether that be through their families or as an exchange student. One of my friends, who is an exchange student from Japan, mentioned how easily accessible certain aspects of school were for her. Yet, the one thing she said that made things easier were the people and community that she found in Canada. I do believe that the diversity has deeply helped create a community for the people of Canada, whether that be through people who are interested in the world outside of North America or through local cuisine. BC's school system currently is pushing its students to celebrate multiculturalism, or at least acknowledge it. Yes, in the past our education system may have been hung to dry, but the more time goes on, the more our systems will be able to catch up with previously said influx.